All right. Welcome, everybody, to our very first virtual roundtable. I'm joined here today by Max and Matt to answer some of the really awesome questions that have been asked by our amazing community. For those of you who've never heard my name before, I'm Richard Stark. I'm one of the support team members here at Matomo, and I'll be asking some really great questions. I'll give it over to Matt for about a 30-second intro for him. He is the CEO and founder of Matomo.
Thank you, Richard. Yeah, so I'm the original founder of Matomo. Almost 15 years ago, we're going to celebrate the 15 years this year. And we create the best alternative to Google Analytics. So a platform for web analytics for web professionals. And we have strong privacy guidelines, and we try to implement privacy by design and by default. And yeah, we have a lot of cool plans in the works. And thank you all for joining and submitting your questions.
Great, thanks so much for that intro, Matt. And then I'll give it over to Max to introduce himself. Max Schrems is the chairman or the honorary chairman of the noyb, and he is a lawyer focusing in privacy law. Max, over to you.
Yeah, I guess we'll quickly did like privacy litigation in Europe, and I started that myself, and then we turned into like an NGO, so to say now, with about 20 people working on exactly that. We have this GDPR, but there's a lot of people that don't really follow it in reality or just pretend to. And that's kind of the focus of the NGO, is to kind of make sure that what's in the books is actually also arriving on phones and displays in the EU, and is not just a theory, but that we turn privacy into reality there as well.
Awesome. Great. Thanks so much for that intro. So yeah, we're going to jump straight into the questions. So all of these questions were crowdsourced from the community. This is both the noyb community as well as the Matomo community. So the first question is for both Max and Matt. What was the tipping point that got you interested in privacy?
Want to start, Max?
Oh yeah, like for myself, I think I was mainly studying in the US for half a year as a high school student. And I think at that time it was weird for me to be in a school where it's like CCTV cameras and you had to sign in and everything was documented. And even the teachers were worried about the head office because you had to type in leaves within like 2 minutes in the computer and so on. I think that was the first time I was like, that's weird. And I think after that, you looked into, after 9/11, there was a lot of these surveillance questions that came up the first time. And I think that connected with having a bit like IT education in high school in Austria before, so that you kind of had a rough idea of how computers work. And then as a lawyer, that kind of got me into that topic. And it really kind of tipped off when I was like for half a year in Silicon Valley. And we had like a couple of people from big companies like Facebook that kind of told us, you know, you can do whatever you want because the Europeans are kind of cute with their law, but if you don't follow it, nothing happens anyways. And they were absolutely right about it. And that was kind of where I was like, this is getting interesting.
Yeah, and privacy, similar story, actually. We both probably got into it as young students. For me, it was more around like the internet, really. Before internet, I don't think privacy would have been as obvious to me. But with the internet, you know, putting my life online, right? Taking photos, blogging, even journaling on my computer, and then being a bit of a data geek, you know, collecting all this data about me, bank statements and all of that. And then you realize, you know, what if somebody can see this data? And then you realize, well, there's no privacy. So how do you get privacy? And I started thinking, and then at the same time, I was, a student and into IT as well, and kind of learning to build little sites and apps. And then realizing, if you have control over the software and you can see what the software does, then you can kind of control your privacy that way. So I think I came through privacy in a bit indirect way. And it first went through the open source movement. And then through that movement and realizing how much data is coming on the internet, you know, we went through the whole evolution, and from no internet to these days having so much of a trail online. And so mixing in with all these open source people from Germany, a lot of them, and France and, Austria, and they had some more privacy spirit as well behind them. And I think I got into it, through others as well as through my own. But certainly the Germans, I want to say, they really helped me as well. Realize the importance of privacy. I think they've been through history, through some hardship with mass surveillance. Yeah, and then as you mentioned, a big wake-up call was also after 9/11 and the first whistleblowers talking of mass surveillance. And then when Edward Snowden came out, it was later on, but the confirmation, and it proved that we were right to be careful and care about this. And so thank you, Edward Snowden, I want to say. That was a nice
Yeah, that was some really great
I
answers.
called Snowden at a certain point the Chernobyl of privacy, in the sense of like the point where it was undeniable that there is a problem.
Yeah. All right, awesome. I think we can go to the next question. So this one again is for both Max and Matt. It is a multi-part question, so I'll start off with the first section. I think Max is maybe the best one to kind of start this one off as well. Are you optimistic about the new privacy shield for data transfers to the US?
Not really, to be honest. Like, we have a fundamental problem with the US, and it's kind of hard for us also to litigate it, because usually we try to litigate stuff where there's a solution. and in this case, we have a political problem. Basically, in the US, the law says there's got to be mass surveillance for non-American citizens, and only Americans are protected under the Fourth Amendment. So what's done right now in the US would be absolutely illegal if it's done on American citizens, but as long as you're a foreigner, you're fair game. And that reality would have to change in the US, because that kind of clashes with Article 8 of the European Charter for Fundamental Rights. So either the US changes its laws, or the US or the European Union changes its fundamental founding principles that are in the treaties, which means each member state would have to agree to it. Both of it is not overly realistic right now. I see more potential in the US for change, because there is a huge business interest, or should be a huge business interest in the US, to have data from foreigners treated fairly. Because I'm usually saying, it's like if it's Switzerland, if they say, give us all your gold, but you don't have property rights once it's here, no one the fuck would ever give gold into Swiss banks anymore. But that's a bit the proposition that America does on data. It's like, give us all your data, but once it's here, you have no rights. And I don't think that that's going to fly in the long run. Also for more sensitive data that is just, if we talk about sanctions and stuff like that, there's a lot of data that is really relevant for companies, and that they probably don't want to have exposed that much. And I think that is going to be a fundamental question for the US. If you want to be the global cloud, you also have to have global rights, and not just rights for your own people. And I'm a bit worried that if there is a new treaty or a new agreement, it would be a bit like Privacy Shield, like some put together bullshit that is just going to collapse again. And I think largely it's a political game. Like, if politics says we want to have a deal no matter what, they will pass another one, and it will probably be overturned another time. But it doesn't really solve much so far.
Yeah. Matt, I don't know if you wanted to maybe add to that one. Max has kind of covered quite a lot of the thoughts around that one, I reckon. But if you wanted to add something to that one as well.
Well, what Max said is my understanding. With as long as they have mass surveillance, then you cannot guarantee safe transfer of data. And then I'm wondering about the encryption, if there could be something with encryption. But from the technological perspective, if you start encrypting the data in a way that US government cannot read it, then it makes it kind of hard to provide a useful service for the cloud company. So for that reason, I think,
and the encryption, to probably add to that, because it's oftentimes asked, and there is upstream surveillance, which is basically on the backbone. And encryption could be a tool there to a large extent, because if it's basically you can't intercept it anymore. The problem is that most of what we're looking into is PRISM or downstream surveillance, which is actually happening at Google, Facebook, whoever it is. And they usually have the data in the clear. And under US law, you have to provide the data as long as you have custody, possession, or control. That's the three magic words in the US law. And as long as they have the code or some way of actually accessing the data in the clear, they can be just obliged to then decrypt it. So we have a lot of these submissions, for example, in the Google Analytics cases as well, where Google says, oh, but we have a hard drive that had encryption. I was like, cool, my phone has that too, but if I unlock it, you know, and they have a lot of these bullshit arguments. Like my favorite one was that they have a fence around their data center, the sign "Do not enter." I was like, I'm not sure that the NSA is going to be overly impressed about your sign there. But that's like, they try to just list these endless things of like technical measures that are just, if you go through it as like a person that has some idea of technology, you're just like bullshit, 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 and you're through. But it still seems to impress compliance people to be like, oh, there is 10 pages of something. And that's basically the game they tried to do. I'm super interested in that, if I may expand on that for a second, is like if people just sue them after all, because if I invest millions of euros into a software product that guarantees me that it's all legal, and in reality it's not, then usually you're just liable for that as Google, Amazon, whoever it is. And it's going to be interesting if that comes up in like down the road at some point.
Yeah, so I mean, do you see any possibility for any sort of updates that could be made to any sort of legislation to protect that data? Would it require something at a bit more of a fundamental level in terms of legislation to kind of fix those issues?
I think for the US side, the most basic thing is that you would have to have like what they have for their own citizens, which is approval by a judge, for example, and individual approval of a surveillance capacity. Right now, it's basically that they approve a whole surveillance system for a whole year, and then the operators can do whatever they want to do, more or less. And there's no redress, even if they go beyond what they are allowed to do. You're never going to find out, and there's no court you can go to complain. So a lot of that is just very fundamentals. And it's interesting because after Snowden, they have fixed a lot of these things for their own citizens. And I think now the question is to add that for foreigners. And there's just this fundamental cultural problem in the US that there is just our people and the others, which is very different than in Europe, where all these rights are now human rights. So if a Chinese person is living in Berlin, they have exactly the same privacy rights as any German. So that's the general rule. I have to add that even in the EU, we have that problem still for government surveillance, that they are still kind of this idea of, you know, your own citizens and the others, which in a global world just leads to this fragmentation. That basically would mean you have to keep all your data nationally, which we all don't want. But it is kind of a result of that system. So ideally, if we shift globally to more of a human rights-based approach, which also means that everybody has the same rights, your own people and foreigners, then you can have a globalized internet. Once you differentiate by nationality or geography, you end up with having silos in data, because it means it can't go there, otherwise it loses all the rights.
Yeah, I think somebody mentioned it the other day. It's kind of like in the phrase of the internet is growing borders sort of situation.
Yeah. And I think we're going to have that. To be honest, it's not, I don't like that. And my name is oftentimes attributed to that movement. And I personally am not a big fan of it. But to a large extent, for a long time, governments just didn't regulate the internet. It was like this strange space where everybody could do whatever they want to do. Now we have exactly the opposite. Like every government is regulating everything online now. And that automatically means you're confronted with 200 different legal regimes. And to a certain extent, you got to make a choice which one you want to follow and which one not. And if you want to be, I don't know, right now in Russia or not, and follow like their views. And for example, even between the EU and the US, you have different views about freedom of speech. Like we, for example, in Austria, Holocaust denial is a crime. In Germany, in the US, it's freedom of speech. So, you know, which one, as a company, which one are you going to follow? And that automatically generates problems. And I think in the European bubble, we have to make sure that we at least have a common framework on the European level, which for a lot of these topics, we don't even have that. And then on a global level, there will, in reality, for a long time, be a difference between especially authoritarian countries. My hope is that among like democratic countries, we can probably agree on some baselines and therefore have free flow of data there at least.
Yeah, so the next question is for Max. What does the NOYB's tech stack look like? So for example, you know, web analytics, CMS, etc.
So I have to add that we have like 5 tech people, and I know a lot of like organizations our size, 20 people, will not have that capacity. So for ourselves, we usually use open source stuff and host everything ourselves as far as possible. I can tell you for, usually we use for our internal stuff, we use Nextcloud as like the data storage place. We have different ones for that, public ones, internal ones, and so on. All of that is segregated into individual little pots. For CMS, we have Drupal right now, mainly because of multilingual options that we need, and WordPress or so doesn't really work well on that. For analytics, we don't use that much, to be honest. We do have Matomo right now, but we're using it right now to analyze the server logs only. So we use that function to not even have anything on the website. To a large extent, that is because we didn't want to have a cookie banner. We didn't want to have any of these things, and just want to say, okay, we really just take like the cleaned up server logs and run through that, and that gives us the intelligence we need. But it limits you. It definitely limits you in what you can see. It was for us like a choice to make for that side. If I guess that's the most relevant one for this call. And yeah, and last one, the most complicated one literally was to get a mailing system that works, that delivers for newsletters. So we ended up with an Austrian company that also self-hosts everything. And that's oftentimes also a benefit. Like, for example, in that case, you got the email address of the CEO. And if we had some technical issues, like, oh yeah, I can add that to the API, it's there tomorrow, and it's done. And you don't really get that if you're with, I don't know, MailChimp or something.
Yeah. It's very, very true. All right, so our next question is for both Max and Matt. The GDPR has helped to contribute to wider global data protection standards. How confident are you that this will continue to build as a true global movement that will benefit all consumers? And what action do we need to take, or what would it take to accelerate this to a global action?
I think there's going to be a very realistic economic reality. Like if you want to be among the major Western countries, most of them have a GDPR-like law. Even like, you know, if you look at the US, there is Canada to the north that has a law, and Mexico to the south. I think we're oftentimes overestimating that basically the US is the big player that doesn't have such a regulation, and almost everybody else moves towards it or has something similar. So I think if you look at like the kind of economic powerhouses, so to say, in somehow democratic countries, you usually have a trend towards that. I don't think that the GDPR is the smartest thing. I usually call it the least stupid privacy law we have so far. And I think to a large extent, we got to think we're at the beginning of this digital transformation. And, you know, industrialization still took 100 years to debate workers' rights, and we're still debating them today. So I'm sure we're going to have that on privacy as well. And the European way may not be the ultimate truth. And we shouldn't, like, you know, impose that thing on the rest of the world. But I think at least among, so to say, democratic countries, there should be a framework, like, for example, the Convention 108, which is open to non-EU countries as well, to have a joint framework. Because what would be terrible is what you see now in the US, for example, on state level, is that each state starts some kind of patchy privacy law that does one thing and the other thing and so on. How are you going to develop software for that? Like, it's just not going to be doable anymore at some point. And I think that is my biggest fear, is that we have to kind of get these basics the same way, which interestingly happened already, and then make sure that it stays consistent, because otherwise, first of all, it's terrible for business to ever comply with. And secondly, for people, it's also going to be super hard to figure out what their rights are in each given situation. And so if you have a somewhat core frame that makes some sense, I guess that's what my hope would be in the next years.
Yeah, and I think that's maybe something kind of important to highlight, is that, you know, when you have these certain types of laws that are applicable to companies, when the cost of compliance outweighs the cost of non-compliance, then companies are not going to do anything to change their behavior.
Exactly. And that is exactly the learning lesson, I think, from the GDPR. The whole idea of having these like extreme penalties of like 20 million euros, which I at the time was like, are you crazy? This is way too much. The 4% makes sense, but the 20 million would apply to one person business as well, theoretically. That was the idea. The problem that we have right now is that we lack the enforcement. So that's also, for all this digital regulation, going to be a huge issue. Is it's nice to put that in laws, but you need the personnel, you need the capacity, you need the technical knowledge and so on of governments to actually enforce that. And that is something we still see missing. And we have that every time, like in the privacy bubble, they call it a risk-based approach, and it's basically doing this calculation of if you cross, if you jaywalk at 2 o'clock in the morning on a street where there's no one else and no one is going to watch you anyways, no one gives a fuck about that red light, me neither. And that is a bit how a lot of the privacy compliance, I think, is working right now. And there's a huge lack of HR. There's just not people knowledgeable understanding it fully. Everybody that read the GDPR for 2 minutes suddenly got a job in 2018, and now these people are sometimes sitting around and are not a bit frustrated with when reality hits. And we see that now with decisions actually trickling down, which is slow, but they're still coming up. You see that a lot of this kind of privacy professionals are so far detached from what the law really says. But within that community, there's a certain myth or stuff that is talked about, and they feel the middle ground of that community is reality, and the reality in the law is oftentimes some far off. And I think that is when for example, this Google Analytics decision, when that hit with the CNIL in France making that decision, I mean, it's one lousy little website and it took 9 years, so it's actually really terrible on non-enforcement. But for that community, it was mind-blowing that actually what the Court of Justice said twice could actually be enforced in reality somewhere as well. And that shows a lot how this enforcement gap is still a huge problem. And that's kind of what we're working on anyways.
Yeah. And that response kind of leads really nicely into the next question that was actually for you as well, Max. What is your take on the lack of consistency when it comes to data protection authorities in different member states enforcing the GDPR? How can it, this response be improved so that there's less confusion within the market?
Yeah, I think a lot of the confusion is generated by the market itself and less from the DPA. So it's exactly that approach of, oh, no one has ever enforced it, so let's just assume the law doesn't say it. And then we're confused if one DPA actually does it. So it's a bit like, we criticize the DPAs a lot, but you also want to protect them a lot from that criticism. Because fundamentally, as always in law, it's the compliance is a matter of you as an individual. Like, I can't go to a judge and be like, hey, can I murder that person or not? It's my responsibility to know that I can't kill other people, and no one is going to give me advice on that, or tell me how likely it is that I'm going to go to jail. So I think that that privacy market has a very weird dynamic compared to any other field of law. Like, no one would say, a judge has to inform me beforehand that I could actually go to jail. Like, this is not how anything works. But in the privacy bubble, that myth or that idea is somehow very prevalent. And I think generally most DPAs try to do the right thing. They have huge problems in finding the right people. They have huge problems in capacity. I think they'll have oftentimes a huge problem in the culture, because for 20 years they didn't have enforcement powers. So it's like these little kids that suddenly grow huge arms and don't know what to do with it. So I think that's a big part. And then we have a couple of countries where you just see that it's a business model to not enforce. We obviously work with Ireland a lot, where you just see they always have a wonderful, great reason why, for like literally, for example, the data transfer cases are 8.5 years now without the decision in first instance. So we went to, I think, 7 courts to kick their ass to even issue some fucking decision, which is then going to be appealed anyways for another 5 years. But if you have a regulator that so fundamentally is not willing to do anything, I can tell you in Austria, a lot of that would be a criminal offense. Like, we even filed one case for abuse of office. And I think we're in some DPAs, and that's not by far not the majority, we're really at a level where you have to think about if that is, conduct that at least outside of Ireland would probably be a criminal matter. But good thing is in Ireland, there is no such law. So you can basically, as a public figure, just not do your shit and still not have a problem. And I think that is, again, not a privacy issue. It's a broader issue. We have some member states in the European Union that try to attract international business by not enforcing EU law. And that's the same thing for workers' rights or taxes, all that kind of stuff. And I think privacy is just one of these elements to attract people, and unfortunately work quite well.
Yeah. All right. So our next question is for both Max and Matt. How can the GDPR balance making the internet better for consumers without simply creating borders? What ways can we keep the internet border-free and secure at the same time?
Max, you touched on that earlier, and Yeah, I liked what you said. I think the way I see it is that, yeah, it does create border. Hopefully it's only temporarily, while other borders also have the same data rights for citizens. So Max, I was asking you, you said 20 years. So maybe it's a temporary situation. For 20 years, we'll have borders a bit, but they will slowly resolve, hopefully, as the countries adopt some strong data regulation. Yeah, I don't see a strong another thing that could happen. What is your, yeah?
I think for privacy rights, I think we're already pretty far with these kind of adequacy decisions and systems to declare another country adequate to your own. We don't have that in other areas of law that much. I mean, we don't have an adequacy decision for freedom of speech or something like that. So my 20 years was more of like, we have 20,000 other rights that we haven't aligned at all. And it oftentimes has a very deep history in countries and cannot be changed that quickly. And I think that is going to be the 20 years at least to kind of somehow flatten out. I think for privacy among, again, the kind of more democratic Western countries and so on, it's realistic to get that done in 10 years or even less for most other countries, to be honest. Like, I mean, most other countries have a fairly similar system. The European Union pushes these adequacy decisions a lot and to exactly figure that problem out. The big outlier is the US and being at the same time extremely dominant in that market. So that's a bit, I think if you kind of count countries or, you know, customers or so on, you got that. And I mean, the reality, I think for a lot of businesses is that they would just comply with the GDPR anyways globally and just basically up the rights for the Americans, despite there being a vacuum. Because operationally it's just easier than separating. And it depends obviously on the business, but I think for a lot of people that will be the de facto standard. And I think that's for privacy, the answer. Again, don't forget that there's 100 other rights that may limit your data flows for something else.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so next question for Max. We've seen a lot of large companies and big tech companies being fined for GDPR breaches. Why is it that these large companies have been the focus? And at what point do you think smaller companies will become targeted with these sorts of fines that we've been seeing?
I think the large ones are just getting the more press. If you look at, it depends on the country a lot and the strategy of the DPAs, but for example, I can tell you in Austria as my home country, there's a lot of 5,000 euros fines, 10,000 euro fines going out there as well. They're just oftentimes not reported, not even put on a website. They just basically happen below the surface and are just not getting headlines. So I think that's already a reality. And that oftentimes is just because a customer of that company or oftentimes an employee of that company started to complain about something and you got there. The other operators or other organizations or DPAs that are more really focusing on the big guys. We ourselves focus on the big guys as well. Usually we do have cases that are broad and that go against like not SMEs, but like medium-sized companies as well, where we usually settle cases as soon as they comply. So there's no benefit to be had in having these endless debates. But I think in the long run, this is going to trickle down to a certain extent, especially because just people, their customers and their employees oftentimes just complain, and therefore it becomes a case, and the DPAs can ignore the fact that that's a small company, and so.
All right, so our next question is for Matt. How can small businesses with small budgets ensure compliance?
I think one big problem that I see in the market is that we have a lot of people claiming to be GDPR compliant and to not really be honest about that. So I think oftentimes, first of all, you should check if they have any kind of GDPR stuff on their website anyways. There's still huge companies that don't even talk about it. And then to get a feeling of if that's realistic or just a marketing claim. And we see that a lot of it is just a marketing claim. If you do a larger investment, I would absolutely have, if possible, a contract or something saying that they're liable for that. Because if you get a hefty fine, or also just if you have to move your system somewhere else. And when I talked to a couple of like large investors for, going into different cloud providers in the US, and they were like, yeah, it's all legal because we have the SECs and standard contractual clauses and that in place. I was like, great, if you think that that's all legal, put it in the contract that if you need to move from their system because it turns out it's not legal, they pay for it and they're liable for it. Turns out none of these companies wanted to sign one of these contracts. So I think that's oftentimes a good test to if you do really large investments or stuff that really cripples your business, if you have to move away, is to get that reassurance that they actually guarantee for that shit and it's not just a marketing claim.
Absolutely. Yeah, so I am definitely aware of the time. So this is going to be our last question from the community. And this is for both Max and Matt. How can people stay in the loop with GDPR news and changes? And are there any sources that you would both personally recommend to make it easy to stay up to date with all the changes that are happening?
Good newsletters, the ones I read. There's the noyb, really good to see they have an editorial and then the fines that have been given. So it kind of reminds you of this is being enforced, it's real, and that's a good one. Then there's the IAPP, the Industry of Privacy Professional, International Association of Privacy Professionals. So this is quite dense, and if you're really into privacy, this is an excellent resource. And then, follow key people on Twitter. I think I get a lot of advocates on Twitter, and then also follow Matomo. Then you will make sure to post anything relevant to, web professionals on our website in the future as well. I'm sure there's a lot more, and I don't know, Max, if you have any good.
I think what I would add, what we do without like trying to self-promote, but we have this GDPR Today newsletter that you mentioned. We have about, I think, 7,000 people that follow that, mainly kind of DPOs or privacy professionals, where we translate all the decisions, which is a lot of work here. Each week that came out, do an English summary of a decision in, I don't know, Latvian, and put all of that on GDPR Up. That's basically a wiki where everybody can also add it and add your own decisions, or if there's a mistake, improve it. And that's all free. So that's basically for professionals to get literally academic neutral information, what is really decided, because a lot of the rest, a lot of the newsletters are very political in my view. Like they want some answer, and it's more kind of lobbying than like a neutral summary of what was decided. I think the other thing I would add to the list is whatever your local DPA does. A lot of them also have newsletters or RSS feeds or whatever it is, to follow that a bit as well, because that gives you an idea of where they focus right now, what they do. And we still have a lot of these guidelines that are different per country. Like we did a project on cookie banners, and probably each one of them has a different list of what your cookie banner should be compliant with, which is not ideal. There should be a European list. Last thing, talking about European, the EDPB guidelines, I think, would be the other thing that everybody should literally get in their mailbox, because that is the kind of authoritative European summary of each one of these elements of the GDPR. They are unfortunately sometimes 100 pages long, which I guess for the average DPO is a bit of an overkill. But if you have at least an idea that there is a guideline on it, then you can read up if you feel like you have that problem right now on your desk. And they're usually quite well written and quite understandable for non-lawyers as well.
Yeah, all right. So that's all the questions that we had lined up from the crowdsourced questions. Matt, did you maybe have a question for Max?
Yeah, I guess, Max, I'm really, I don't know if it's a question, but I want to say really good luck for your work on the advertising industry. I think that's a huge one, and really much needed. And I really look forward to the outcome of that, to change the industry from the inside, rather than, so that's really powerful, and good luck. I don't have questions actually, but thank you for your work. It's great to.
I want to add that there's a lot of other people working on that as well. We had just a decision there in Belgium, for example, that came from Johnny Ryan working on that. So there's interest in that area. Luckily, we're not the only ones, and there's a lot of other people working on that as well. So I'm somehow hopeful there as well.
Yes, Johnny Ryan is doing great work as well. Yeah.
Great. Max, did you maybe have a question for Matt before we finish off this webinar?
I think for more of a customer thing is sometimes a lot of this kind of compliance stuff I think what would be really interesting for a lot of software products is if there would be like a model privacy policy for them, for customers to use. So for example, it's still oftentimes hard to even like figure out what a software fully does. And if one lawyer does that once for a software package, it's much easier for all the customers to just copy paste that if it's like approved and proper. And I think that would oftentimes be really interesting to kind of build these compliance tools into software, because if you're like a lawyer that for the first time, let's say, looks at Matomo, you're like, okay, what are they really doing? What's there? What, you know, it's really hard to sift through it. And oftentimes I feel that there's a lot of work that is just done 120 times again and again, and probably not at best quality because people don't understand the product that well. And I feel oftentimes that would be cool if that would come out of the seller, so to say, of the product that knows it probably best. But I don't know if there's any thoughts in that direction.
Yes, no, that's absolutely. Yeah, we are thinking of that. And yeah, the idea is to, you know, to be privacy advocates, you, as a product, you need to just make privacy center. And it means you need to make it as easy as possible, right? And that includes this, as you mentioned, to make it clear what information you track, make it, you know, one click, and just make everything transparent and surface what's important and not bog people down with all the details, which it's a journey, right? Where when the GDPR came out, we had to read the law and, you know, understand how to map it to the product, and we've done it. And now we can starting to reflect that, yeah, it's got a bit too complex. We can really simplify things. So I think that's the next level. And yeah, we will definitely do work on that.
Cool.
Thanks for the suggestion.
Awesome.
Oh, brilliant, Max. Thanks for your time.
Yeah, thank you both for joining the call tonight. It's really great to kind of get your perspectives on these sorts of issues. And yeah, I just wanted to say thank you again to the community for providing all the questions for our presenters tonight. We hope to be able to bring you some more of these sorts of virtual roundtables in the future. So please stay tuned. And if you've made it all the way to the end with us, thank you so much for watching and joining us. And until next time.